Hey everybody, it's Lisa, and this is another Purple Puddle Rant. Today we're going to be talking about a pretty heavy topic, and if you haven't tuned in before, typically our commentary is just topics of the day, political rhetoric, or anything that is a systemic problem in America. But I've recognized that the topic I'm going to talk about today actually hits home on a global level. Pedophilia, the crime against sexual assault on children, has something that made headlines in the past 2 years, not only in Canada, but throughout France and Europe. And as we see court cases brought forth talking about what is the age of consent and at what point children can consent to sexual acts, we typically will go back into the moral question about what is when a person is emotionally mature enough to consent to sexual activity. Historically, in the United States, 16 has been the age of consent. I believe in some areas it has been dropped to 15, as we find the hypersexualization of children just rampantly increasing nationwide, as well as globally, honestly. But we also find that there are, many more teenagers who are engaging in activity that perhaps 50 years ago was not happening. In this nation, of course, 50 years ago, we had intact families more prevalent than we do now. Our divorce rate kind of goes in sync with the early onset of sexual activity in teens. And so it became obvious that when two teens were consenting to sex, instituting statutory rape charges were not in the best interest of those teens. It was a response to predatory laws that were being misinterpreted, perhaps misapplied to boyfriend and girlfriends of a similar age, one being under the age of consent, one being above the age of consent. And so, of course, there was a moral outcry regarding criminalizing and arresting 17-year-old boys for having sex with their 16-year-old girlfriends. That's not what I'm talking about when I talk about pedophilia. Pedophilia is more clinically described as an adult, meaning over the age of 18, more along the lines of 45 is probably the average, and a child that is well under the age of 16. So we're talking 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. And pedophilia is something that I consider even more grotesque than child molestation. I did not bring a dictionary with me today, so you'll have to Google those definitions to see the clear distinction. But for the purposes of our conversation, pedophilia is going to be that aggravated child molestation in which a child is not only a target that has been groomed for sexual gratification of an adult, but it is typically someone outside of the family confines or outside of the normal interactions that one might naturally associate with child molestation. For example, a uncle, for example, and a niece. That's child molestation if something happened, but pedophilia, we're looking beyond the scope of mere petting, beyond the scope of masturbation or exposure. I can't even think of what it's called, but when someone exposes themselves to a child. When I use the word pedophilia, and for this conversation, I'm talking about a much more sinister, if obviously the first three examples I gave of masturbation, petting, and exposure, those are sinister acts. But in the society that we live in today, they're almost taken as par for the course, not because they should, but because it has become so prevalent, and we have done so little to counteract those activities as our nation and our worldview expounds. But when I'm speaking of pedophilia, I'm talking about a more explicit and more aggravated or more prevalent um, child molestation. It just occurred to me to address an issue that happened when I was in high school. I went to high school in the metropolitan Atlanta area, and there was a man who typically exposed himself routinely, not typically, routinely exposed himself to girls who were walking along a particular path in Brookhaven. Now, Brookhaven is a fairly well-to-do area of town, and even back then in the late 80s, it was considered a decent neighborhood. And there was a man who drove a truck, I want to say it was a white truck, and he would routinely masturbate and expose himself to teen girls who walked along that road. I know myself as well as several other girls who had this same complaint that there was this person who would do that. And I don't even remember what we called this person, but it was just taken for granted that this was a person who was acting outside of the normal human interaction. He was not necessarily thought of as a predator. I never told my parents about him. I doubt anyone did. The police never picked him up to our knowledge. I mean, because this went on for years. And, you know, having one person who never actually comes in contact, close proximity to the quote-unquote victim allowed us to tolerate that type of behavior, to dismiss it in our minds and to dismiss it as an act of normalcy. However, we never prosecuted or treated that particular person. So fast forward to numerous cases like that, because anyone who is a child predator, if they can be rehabilitated, it takes intensive therapy, intensive sessions to correct that wrong thinking that they have established, which is why dealing with predatory acts or dealing with sexuality at a young age in the home based on morality is so important. But when we find educators, when we find the school system is the one that's teaching sex education, we come up with a much more diverse range of what is normal, because politicians and those who design curriculum do not always have the same interest of the child's family or even our biblical foundation as a nation. Of course, if you add other governments' influences into America, which you do every time an immigrant comes to this country, you might also widen the view of what is appropriate sexual behavior. And therefore, when the schools teach sex education, they're not teaching from a position of abstinence. They're not teaching from a position of what is appropriate, inappropriate, or what might be an age of consent. They're teaching in more generalities, more about hygiene than anything else. A sex education class can never take the place of a parent instructing their child or teaching their child in the way they should go. All of that is to lay the context for the current lack of morality that we have in this country and most certainly the world when we begin discussing pedophilia. Now, as I've said, in recent years, there have been some court cases in Europe and Canada that have looked at the age of consent, looked at adjusting it for our modern times. We know that children as early as 8, 9, 10, and 11 have not only begun the puberty process, because the average range of the onset of menstruation has increased. And when I say increased, that means a younger girl is now going through puberty changes at an earlier age. You can blame McDonald's, you can blame all the additives we put in our food, and there have been some studies to suggest that the changes in our diets have influenced the maturation age of children. But it is also coming from the media. It is also coming from technology, because unfortunately YouTube has become a babysitter for so many children. And when you do look at children's programming now, you find much more explicit references to sex, sexual behavior, and sexual development. All of these things kind of go into a perfect storm. Earlier maturation of children, explicitness of television and other programming that is of sexual content, and then the lack of homeschooling with regard to morality or our biblical foundation as a nation, and that education, that so important education of regarding sex and regarding your body that's occurring in a school in a more general terms, with a hygienic focus rather than a purity focus. So when you have all of those perfect storms come into play, then obviously you're going to have children who are hypersexed. And when I say that, I mean that they are exposed to sexual topics and sexual experiences at a younger age before the full maturation of their mind, will, and emotions. All of that causes legislators to want to change the age of consent. Now, I don't know how 16 became a magic number in the first place. I will be honest to say I didn't do a lot of research on that because I'm speaking to you more in terms of a specific focus that I have yet to get to. But since 16 was that magic age that was brought forth almost universally in first and second world nations, and it is now being looked at differently, not only because we had young men that were being incarcerated, or even young women that were being incarcerated or charged with statutory rape for having consensual sex with their teenage girlfriends or boyfriends. Now we have various generations of sexual assault against teens, pedophilia, and incest and child molestation. All of these things are now happening in a more numerous occurrence, a more frequent occurrence. That's the word I was looking for. We're actually finding that those types of activities that used to be abnormal are now happening so frequently, and they are unable to be treated in a easy amount of time, a short amount of time, that now our definition of normal is called into question. And this actually comes from a practice that has been happening in mental health ever since the mental health facilities were closed in our country. I'm speaking of America right now. We have found that when mental health services are reduced, either through the government or through the community, we find that those who have problems of an emotional or our mental nature are given a certain window, let's just say arbitrarily 12 visits, in which they must show some sort of progress because their benefits run out at that time. We don't have any long-term treatment for these types of mental illnesses that would cause someone to molest a child or cause someone to become a pedophiliac. Because we don't have services in place for those people, we begin to normalize that behavior, because what happens in a child molestation case 9 times out of 10 is it creates not only a victim but another perpetrator. And that has been studied and reported on at least for 50 years, as long as I've been alive. So what you have is now that second and even third generation in some cases of people who have been victims of child molestations, and are now, that rate of pedophilia is increasing as a result of it. So it's a cycle that has been formed, and because those numbers become almost exponential as we go on, we're seeing the rate of pedophilia increase at a supernatural rate. And so again, legislators begin to look at this issue, and just to take a number, let's say the population is 100. If out of that 100 you had 10 children that were molested, that next generation, if those 10 children become perpetrators, now it's jumped to 20, it doubles. And as those numbers multiply, legislators begin to say something like, well, 20% of our population are pedophiliacs. Perhaps this is not an abnormal occurrence any longer because it's so prevalent. Or legislators might be able to use statistics from healthcare workers that, again, when you go see a doctor, you fill out some kind of form and they begin to say, all right, do you have thoughts of this? Have you had any experience with this? And they look at those numbers collectively without any context whatsoever, and they say, well, 25% of our population says that they experience sexual encounters as early as 8 years old. What they're not taking the time to ask people as they gather this survey is the context that makes it interpretable. So, for example, if you have a population of 100 people, 10 were sexually abused as children, and they become perpetrators, and I'm not saying that all do, but just for the purposes of this example, let's say that those 10 do become perpetrators. When you ask them when their earliest sexual encounter is, and they tell you ages like 4, 6, 8, or 12, it's not that that was a natural sexual encounter. However, if you just look at the sheer number, you'll say, oh, people are having sex or sexual encounters at a younger age. What they haven't taken into consideration is the fact that those were abnormal sexual encounters that occurred at the hands of a predator. So again, statistics can be manipulated to reflect any kind of truth that a good statistician is willing to put forth. And so often, and this is not a slam against the World Health Organization, but so often when we're looking at these numbers, we don't have the context for them to make sense in a way that perpetuates the kind of society we want to live in. And again, this is not a first world or even American or even a Christian ideal when I say this. This is actually something that's globally understood, is that we want our children to be able to grow and make the best decisions for their best life. And it's well known, well documented that children, elementary school age children who are pre-puberty, do not have the mental wherewithal to make decisions about sexual encounters, sexual behavior, or sexual intercourse. Why is that? Well, the child, first of all, has not gone through the chemical changes that take place to prepare themselves for those encounters. So if your body has not experienced the maturation process that it would go through in order to procreate, because that's what puberty is. Puberty is the onset of those systems, those endorphins, all of those chemical synapses that take place in order to prepare a woman or a girl for motherhood and a man for fatherhood. It's for procreation. It is not so that you can look good in a bikini, contrary to popular belief. So as children begin to go through this maturation process, the average age was probably 16. It's probably where that magic number came from. We know that up until 21 years of age, males can still be going through, I believe that it's 21 and maybe 24, males can still be going through that maturation process of puberty. And those are after those physical processes have taken place, the mind still, the emotions still have to catch up to that long process called puberty, which is why there are ranges for puberty. So at one point, the range was from 12, 13 to 17 when the onset of puberty began in America, and it may be different in other nations, based on diet or other factors. And those were the female ages. For a male, it was something like 15 to 21. Well, now those numbers have changed thanks to steroids and whatever other ecological considerations have contributed to early onset of puberty. And the lowest age, I believe, is 8, that there are girls who are 8 years old who are beginning the not prepubescent, but actually in the throngs of puberty. So, of course, the hormones that go along with that do have a tendency to make people more sexually curious, more apt to sexually experiment, such as petting or whatever other kinds of early sexual encounters that people engage in. So we have that as an actual biological fact. However, and here's the point. I apologize that it took me 20 minutes to get to why this is such a big deal right now, is because people are coming up with this idea that pedophilia is not abnormal because the age of consent cannot be measured by puberty. The age of consent, it should be measured by whether or not the person enjoys the encounter that they had. That is the discussion, the debate that's coming forth. And there's very few first world countries that are willing to wholeheartedly dive into that. But this practice is actually taking place around the world. And the more that we decrease the age of consent, the more we move toward this whole idea that sexual encounters should be measured by enjoyment, not ability to consent. Why is that a problem? Well, anyone who has been raped, who watches SVU, who knows anything about what happens to the physical body when a sexual assault such as rape occurs, they know that your body can respond as if it was a consensual sexual encounter. What do I mean by that? I mean that there are women who have been raped who experience a sexual orgasm or climax. It is not because they enjoy the rape. It is because it is a physiological and a physical response to contact that mirrors a normal sexual contact. For example, when a woman is raped, it is penetration by a penis to the vagina. That is something that happens when a couple is in love, and it's a joyous experience. However, when they're raped, the the vagina does not have a brain, and therefore your body may have a physiological response. Any rape counselor will tell you that. Of course, it doesn't happen to every woman, and when it does happen to women or men, let's just say, there can be a lot of guilt that's associated with that, because people begin to ask themselves, well, why did I feel this way? Why did I respond this way? I know that there are many women who are, and men as well, who have been inappropriately or unwantedly touched in a sexual manner, and their body will respond as if it were consensual when their mind is telling them, I did not want that, I did not desire that encounter, and I do not want that encounter to ever happen again. But then there's these questions of confusion that tend to arise when they begin to evaluate the fact that their body did respond in a more typical way to that sexual encounter. All of those things, the difference between a biological response, which is what happens when a person climaxes after a rape encounter, and a emotional response, which is what's supposed to happen after a consensual sexual act. Why is this such an important discussion when it comes to pedophilia? Well, a child as early as 4 years old, many people have seen this in a kindergarten classroom, but a child as early as 4 or 5 years old might touch themselves as they learn about the world around them. However, if that behavior is not curtailed, if that behavior is not explained or taught in a way that is appropriate for what is in the best interest of a child, what is considered normal behavior, then that child will continue that exploration of their own body. You know, a newborn sticks their hands in their mouth. We don't go around as a mature adults with our hands in our mouth. It would be a hard fit to get your entire fist in your mouth anyway. But we don't walk around sucking our toes either. This is something a newborn does. And we eventually, that newborn grows out of it, or eventually we teach that newborn, hey, stop sucking your thumb, stop sucking your toes. It's time to walk upright. It's time to grow and mature. Well, 5-year-olds, as they're experiencing their world and their bodies, will have a tendency to touch themselves, their parts of their genitalia or anatomy that we as adults don't go around doing in public. They are taught that, yes, you may explore your body, and yes, this is a part of your body, but you don't spend all day fondling yourself. That's a societal decision. It's also a decision in the best interest of the child. Why? If your fingers are in your pants all day long, you can't get anything done. So there's lots of reasons why we put those. It's not necessarily about morality, but there's lots of reasons why we put certain parameters as in the best interest of humanity as a whole. Well, what we have to reconcile, the fact is that if a body can respond physiologically or biologically to rape in a way that mirrors a consensual sexual act, then a 5-year-old's body can do the same thing, because it has nothing to do with puberty. A 5-year-old's body, the genitalia that's intact from 20 weeks in the womb is the same genitalia that's intact for an adult person. A 5-year-old's body can respond physiologically and biologically to sexual encounters perpetrated by themselves or by someone else. So for a court, for any legislator, for any person for that matter, to suggest that a child as young as 4 or 5 enjoys a sexual encounter has confused that biological response, the same exact biological response that happens or can happen as a result of rape, confusing that reaction, that body's natural reaction to consent, to suggesting that the child enjoyed it. The child has no idea what is even happening at that age. In fact, a child as young as 12 who may understand the idea of intercourse has not emotionally or mentally developed enough to understand the repercussions of intercourse. So I can understand the mechanics of a car. I drive a car every day. I can understand how to change a tire, put gas in that car, operate it to a functional level. I have a license to do so. That does not make me a mechanic. A child can have a biological response to a sexual encounter and to predatory actions. That does not make that child consent to sexual encounters. We cannot trick ourselves into thinking that something like pedophilia is in the realm of normalcy or that a child can consent to sexual encounters. There was a reason, a logic behind that magic number of 16. It coincided with the onset of puberty, because at the onset of puberty, your body has begun the physical changes that go along with sexual encounters. However, it's very obvious by the number of children who have children, by the number of people, even young people, who make sexual decisions based on immaturity. It's very obvious based on those statistics that the mind, will, and emotions even take longer than the body to physically or to develop to the point of being able to handle the consequences of sex. How can we put that same measure on 12-year-olds, 10-year-olds, or even 8-year-olds? That's what some people are suggesting right now. And I want to caution everyone out there just to take into consideration the biological versus the emotional. When a doctor gives you an examination and they check your reflexes, they hit your knee in a certain spot and your leg moves. You didn't make your leg move. Your leg moved as a result of that physical interaction. You had no control over it. However, you could not stop it. The same thing happens when a biological response takes place after a rape or other sexual assault, and more appropriate or normal responses to sexual encounters occur, even though this was an unwelcome sexual encounter. The same thing can happen with a child, and anyone who is willing to indicate that that child enjoyed it is not only lying to themselves, they're perpetrating a crime on the next generation. I just would encourage you that if anyone in your community is putting forth any sort of legislation regarding changing the age of consent, regarding evaluating the age of consent based on enjoyment, or implied consent is a word they like to use a lot. You looked like you enjoyed it, you said you enjoyed it, or I thought you enjoyed it, therefore you enjoyed it. That's ridiculous. We have to safeguard the innocence of children. We have to safeguard our semblance of a healthy, normal society by protecting each other from predators. We have to protect even the idea of what a predator is. It's so important that we not only talk about this with our families, that we take a voice when it comes to legislation that's being proposed. Thank God, as far as I know, this has not happened in America in any state, but there was definitely a question in Canada in recent years. There have definitely been questions in France in recent years, and other countries in Europe. So it's really not that far away, America. I would encourage you to be ever vigilant. This is not something that anyone enjoys talking about. I honestly never thought I'd be talking about pedophilia on camera. But when it occurred to me that the same biological and physiological response that occurs after sexual assault in adults can happen in children, and I've seen it happen in children. When I made that connection, I really felt like I had to say something, because I don't want to see any child become a predator or become a prey at the age of 8, and then we legislate it. It's bad enough when a crime happens against a child, but when we legislate it, it's like adding insult on top of the offense. And obviously those were not the best choice of words, but just to illustrate the point, we cannot allow that on our watch. Find out more about pedophilia. Find out more about legislation that's come forth, perhaps not in the United States, but in other countries, because, again, this is a problem. This is not something that's going to go away. As we legislate our way out of morality, these types of issues will creep up, and more children, as well as adults, will be victimized. It's very important that we stand up for our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that means not being the target of a sexual assault, regardless of what age we are. Thanks so much for listening. I know that was a tough topic, and hopefully we won't have to revisit it, but, by His will. Thanks so much. Have a great day.